in the interest of time, we'll get started. Can everybody introduce themselves?
Yeah. So do we have oh yeah, are folks in the room? They're up, everybody's here.
Mhm.
Okay. Shall I go, Wendy?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
My name is Hermine Hayes Klein. I'm an attorney. I'm based in Portland, Oregon, and my work focuses on human rights in pregnancy and childbirth. And that half of that is, my practice really involves representation of community midwives and freestanding birth centers and doulas. And then half of my practice involves representing people who are, suffered, mothers and pregnant people who suffered injury in childbirth, including situations in which their rights of all of which involves circumstances in which their informed consent was violated. So this is my focus, and I've been doing it for about 15 years now.
Thank you. Wendy?
Yeah, my name is Wendy Kleckner, and I have been a midwife for 25 years. And along that journey, justice and the law and everything around that kept coming up and bubbling forth. I grew up in a really political family, anyways, so it was always an interest, the law. And then I decided, okay, let's do law school. Let's see what the next path looks like. So about 8 years ago, I went to law school. Became an attorney, and so I'm just starting my journey as an attorney. Still dabbling a little bit as a midwife, but mostly working my way into the legal field. So I am following in the footsteps of some incredible people like Hermine and Julie Gunnagle, who's been great mentors to me as I get started, because my focus will be defending midwives against their board and civil suits, things like that, and also fighting for the rights of pregnant people anywhere, everywhere. So, yeah.
One interesting perspective, having been a midwife first.
Indeed.
Valuable.
I'm going to start with the first question. Do you think that rights are often violated in pregnancy and birth more than in everyday life? In which ways and why?
Wendy, you wanna? It's an interesting question.
Is, and this more or less part of it is hard because what are we comparing it to, I guess, would make me go, I don't know if it's any more than any other part, because I don't know any other part. I know obstetrics real well, but I do know that in obstetrics it's definitely a place where there's a lot of violations of rights and stepping on toes. And mostly because our healthcare system, the way it's set up, and the way that we look and interface with the medical world, puts it at this power differential, puts it at this vulnerable place, put this at the surrender of a doctor that is an all-knowing, all-being kind of a person. And that just sets it up for the scenario of either feeling like you don't have rights or having those rights, overlooked, trampled on, whatever. But yeah.
I agree. And, to add on to that, what's the relationship between rights violations in pregnancy and childbirth and sort of rights in the rest of life and sort of the non-pregnant state? I think it's an interesting opportunity to talk about the international aspect of International Cesarean Awareness Network, because Wendy and I were talking about this a little bit as we were chatting about today's webinar, and how, ICAN has such a great role and opportunity to sort of highlight the different ways that cesarean is overused around the world, because it's overused around the world, and the inspiration for that overuse might have come out of sort of Western obstetrics, but then the way that it's overused is is culturally determined. So what it looks like for it to be overused in Central America, overused in South America looks one way, that's related to cultural, to the culture of those places. And similarly in South Africa and Nigeria, China, different parts of Asia, in India, the sort of divisions between overuse of cesarean for the wealthy in some developing nations, while insecure access to life-saving cesarean for the population that isn't wealthy, that's a common pattern in the developing world. But in general, something I didn't mention, I mentioned what I do now, which is lawyering. But I also, when I got into this work, I was living in Holland and teaching law in The Hague, and so, and from that perspective, I got to study maternal health care around the world and how women's rights are violated in childbirth around the world. And what I learned and really sort of observed was that the way, like, women's rights are abused everywhere. And the way that they are abused in pregnancy and childbirth in each nation is a reflection of the larger context of women's rights in that nation, of their like social, economic, reproductive, civil rights, like how empowered they are. You know what I mean? Is so like New Zealand has the best maternal health care in the world, and that's also the first nation where women could vote, and that generally has the best like equality for women written into the law. And then Northern Europe has better protection of women's, social, economic, reproductive, et cetera, rights, and has better maternal health care, right? Compared to say Southern Europe, where there's more machismo and inequality. And then so it goes around the world as you look at women's status. India, there's communities within India where women have no rights, and are like abused in all kinds of ways. And so then, cultures where women are being slapped and hit, you know what I mean, in childbirth can be a reflection then of the security of their rights, and empowerment outside of the hospital or outside of pregnancy and childbirth. So it's not necessarily a question of more in pregnancy and birth. It's more that it's a reflection, you know what I mean, of their empowerment outside of that space.
That makes sense. And so people are coming up against policy and law and culture. So those three kind of intermix to
And
make
medicine
what it is. And
and
medicine.
physiology. You know what I
Sure.
mean? Like childbirth is universal, human rights are universal, right? And yet the way that birth is playing out and the way that women are getting treated is both similar and different in all these different places.
Yes. So
Yeah.
where is the emphasis in society on women's rights versus, how they are seen in the medical model? And, how much people get reimbursed for women's procedures versus men's procedures
All
is all
relevant.
very interesting. Um, so how do people ensure that their rights are respected during childbirth?
Shall
I
I?
think it's just
I can.
foundational things that we've all talked about a million times, such as really making sure that you've chosen the right provider and the right birth team around you, the right environment, hospital, birth center, home, or woods, I don't know. Making sure that you have those foundational things really secure. The really hard conversations have been had with the provider, with the hospital, even going as far as with the nursing staff that you're going to interact with at that hospital. I mean, it's making sure that all your layers are covered, and we can't scream it enough, but having a doula makes all the world of difference when we're dealing in the childbirth realm, especially if you're choosing a hospital birth and a doctor, having that support person there that kind of knows the system, knows what's coming, can educate, can encourage, can really be there for you, not necessarily advocate for you. There's a fine line of how much they can actually do or say, but even having that one single support person that is just solely there and doesn't have that same emotional attachment that your partner has, can really continually remind you of your rights, can remind you of your birth plan, remind you of the things that you desired, and give you that strength and encouragement to make it happen.
To
So a
supplement
lot. Oh, go
all of
ahead.
that. First step, know your rights. You know what I mean? So understand that you have the right to make all the decisions about your care all the time and about your baby's care after your baby is born. You have the absolute right to decline anything that you are offered. And you have the right to informed consent. And that means that you have the right that before anything is done to you or to your baby, somebody looks at you, tells you what they want to do and why they want to do it, tells you what the options are for treating the situation that they're offering to treat with this offer of treatment. What are your options? What are the risks of your options? Answer all your questions. And all of this is supposed to happen in your language. And support you in making the decision. And that includes the decision to go against whatever recommendation the provider might be making without any feeling of pressure or coercion, manipulation, threats, or force. And so that's the law of informed consent, and it's based on universal human rights and universal bioethics. So the law of informed consent is going to be sort of like usually statutorily encoded, written into the case law of each state, of each nation, but it follows that pattern of what's the procedure, what are the risks, what are the benefits, or alternatives. Answer the questions, the patient makes the decision. That's all bioethics. And so that's why, so you can look up what does my local law say exactly, but those are your rights. And yet anybody who's familiar with birth can ask themselves, what would it look like in there if that actually happened? Right. And so the gap between that law and what's actually happening, it would transform the space, right? If before each thing could be done, or before anybody gives you a cesarean section, you're fully supported in making your best choice between vaginal birth or cesarean section, which you absolutely have the legal and ethical right to do. It would totally transform birth, right? We wouldn't need, to organize the way, with organizations like ICAN. But there's a pretty wide gap between the law of informed consent and the culture of obstetrics, which ignores the law of informed consent. So number one, know your rights so that when you're in the face of a system that's truly acting like they have the right to make the decisions, you remember what's true. You know what I mean? 25 people can be crazy and you're right. They're just part of a system that's just like operating in an illegal and perverse way. And then number two, choose a provider who's willing to respect your rights. You know what I mean? And so if you want a physiological birth, a vaginal birth, find a provider who's an expert in that, who are midwives. You know what I mean? So give yourself a chance by starting out with the providers that are best. If you want a planned cesarean, then start out with an OB or a surgeon. Start out with the people that have expertise in what you want. And then I think the birth plan can be a really good tool for establishing whether they're going to respect your right of informed consent. And what you do is you don't call it birth preferences, you don't call it birth wishes, you write the informed consent birth plan. And then you write, my plan is to make all the decisions about my care on the basis of information, advice, and support from you. Below are what I anticipate might be my decisions for a variety of situations. But of course, things might change. I might change my mind about the things below, and things might come up that aren't anticipated below. And if they do, then you'll let me know what they are, let me know what my options are, let me know what the risks are of each option, and support me in making my decision. That would be my plan. And that gets by what usually happens with birth plans, which is, we love birth plans. But what you need to know is birth can't be planned. You know what I mean? And the implication is always, and when things go like, unpredictably, then we will take back the decision making, let alone if there's an emergency. Because back to what are your rights? You have the right to make the decision all the time, including in an emergency. The only exception to the patient's right to make their own medical decisions are if they are unconscious, meaning knocked out, and incompetent, meaning they have a diagnosis. You know what I mean? And in both of those situations, there's usually a loved one that's in a better position to make decisions for them than the doctor. Only if there's no loved one. You know what I mean? You just got brought in on the ambulance, right? And you're knocked out. Can some life-saving emergency decisions be made on your behalf? Beyond that, nobody gets to say the baby's at risk, so we're going to now force care on you, or we don't have time for a conversation. There's time for a conversation before every single thing that might have to happen urgently. It might be a faster conversation, but there's still time to explain, what needs to happen. So that can if they're like, oh, I'm not comfortable with that, then find a different provider. So that tool can help to sort of shop around for providers. And then have a doula, but have a doula who's willing to advocate for your right of informed consent and refusal if that's important to you. So that means you interview this doula about whether they're willing to do that. And if they start talking about how it's not in their scope and how you need to talk for you, that's not your doula, because that's a made up concept. But by Odona and other organizations, that doulas have a scope and they're not allowed to speak. Doulas can say anything they want. They can absolutely speak up for the client, and that can become absolutely essential in circumstances where the client it is too vulnerable or overwhelmed by the physicality of what's happening in that moment, like the baby's coming out and the doctor's about to cut a non-consented episiotomy, and the doula can speak and say, she said no episiotomy. Or did you ask before you cut her? You know what I mean? That's all totally legit. And so that's what you can do to protect your rights in advance, is to choose your provider, know your rights, have a doula, use a birth plan, and maybe have a lawyer on backup.
Yeah,
And
on speed dial.
Yeah. Let's do that.
ICANN's website, and they have some really great documents on there. There's one that's questions to ask a VBAC provider, questions to ask a doula. So use those resources because they're very extensive and they're really, really good in vetting that provider that you might choose or the doula that you might choose, and getting really detailed answers is always a great thing.
That's so good, because it's all about the choice. I think it doesn't isn't there an article that was written by the unnecessarian Jill Arnold, right? It was like your greatest cesarean risk is your provider. I think she wrote it for Consumer Reports. That's a classic article that ICAN could offer as a resource. Your greatest risk factor is your provider, which reflects that we've got studies that show variation from 7 to 70% across nations, and I mean, no, across hospitals in the United States, and that variation is not about clinical condition of the patients, but provider preference. So coming back to policy, law, and rights, which is kind of a topic of this, like that provider preference is often articulated as policy. You know what I mean? It's our policy that you're only having a cesarean if you had a prior cesarean, and that we're not allowing your baby out your vagina, which kind of which can translate into it's our policy to impose force on you if you try to come in here going through the physiological process that's going to eject your baby out of your vagina. Um, and of course, those are illegal policies. The right to refuse surgery is a constitutional right, and that's well written about in American law. And hospital policies don't get to trump constitutional rights. Doctor preferences don't get to trump constitutional rights. They might prefer it, but you have the right to make the ultimate decision. But yet, those tools we're talking about can help you figure out what kind of a provider you're facing. It can help you. It's not, you know what I mean? That's one of the, it's like one of my mottos is supportive birth shouldn't be for the lucky, because, women do everything they can to set up that good birth. And then it's like the doctor's not on call and, or whatever, and they end up abused. Are we still answering a question?
So the second part of this question then becomes, is there anything that we can say when we're in the birth room, any specific phrasing that we can use to make sure that our rights are respected?
Yeah, I think you can say, this is my doula, Samantha. I've asked Samantha, her role for me today in this labor to be to look out for my right of informed consent and refusal is just very important to me. And so she's just going to make sure that before anything is, done, that somebody takes that time to have that conversation with me and look at me and tell me what my options are and the risks of the options, and to support me in answering my question, so that's something you can do to try to make sure conversations happen before things are done. That doesn't solve every problem though, because a decision around cesarean, what often happens is manipulation, where people are not just being given accurate information, but they know the accurate information. For example, they know there's risk of death to them from another cesarean, but their provider's downplaying or not even talking about that risk. Then you might have to get into, I know I have a right to refuse. I do not want a cesarean section. I'm exercising my right of informed consent. I believe I have that right in this state. Is there an ethicist in this hospital? Could I speak with that person? Is there a patient advocate? Can I speak with that person? all I'm looking for here is support to have a trial of labor, and honest communication about what's happening in my labor and the monitoring of my labor, and to be able to make medical decisions. Those kinds of words.
Yep.
Wendy, what do you think? Is there anything?
I don't know if I could add anything else. Those are the key phrases of,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm exercising my right to whatever.
Klein, to make an informed decision. I'm just trying to get the information I need from you to assess my options and make an informed decision. Nobody cares more about the well-being of my baby than I do. Trust me. Trust me.
And so what if somebody goes into a hospital that has a VBAC ban? Then what do they say? What do they do?
Wendy, do you want to start?
Well, I guess I would somewhat question, the choice of going there. If you are a VBAC and you want a VBAC, then why are you choosing a hospital? And perhaps it's very remote and it's the only option that's out there, and I totally understand that. But it is laying the groundwork before you get there, of whether that's uh, filing a lot of different things you could file with boards and different policies to see if you can shift the policy. But really it's laying that groundwork ahead of time, before you're in that situation. I'll let Hermine speak to anything specific.
Yeah, I mean, so the question is like, Samantha, like, what happens if you go into a hospital with a VBAC ban? Like, do you mean in labor and wanting to not have a C-section? And they are going to tell you we have a policy, and that's just here you are in that circumstance. I guess you'd want to have as many supporters as possible who feel knowledgeable about your rights, who are good communicators. You know what I mean? Because you don't want to come in ready for battle. You know what I mean? Because obviously that's also not helpful to labor, right? So it's like that balance of like going in to an environment that might ultimately be hostile, but yourself, like it's an art form, right? Hold a boundary while being calm, gracious, but having some folks willing to do that would be essential, and then that's when you're going to say, I understand that your recommendation is cesarean section. I do. I do. I understand that again, like the advanced conversations are worth it, because a VBAC ban, like the excuse is usually, we don't have, like, what is it, the 24/7
24
anesthesia?
hours.
And it's
Yeah.
like, why do you do childbirth at all? Isn't it a case that a uterus can rupture anytime? Like, what do you do if a uterus ruptures and there's no anesthesiologist on call? Like, definitely that question should be asked.
Or cord prolapse. I mean, cord prolapse
Right.
has
Or just what do you do if you need to
and
perform an emergency
rupture.
cesarean? It's time sensitive and there's no anesthesiologist on call. What do you guys do? Do you have that on your website, that patients might want to be warned before coming there that you're not ready for that? What do you do? So that's a kind of like a advanced conversation that you could have. But what they would ultimately do, I guess, is transfer you in an ambulance. You know what I mean? And so it's like, I guess I understand that I might have to transfer in an ambulance to another hospital, and I'm willing to cooperate with whatever plan is needed for that. This is something you can say in advance. It's also something you can say when you get there. Um, and you can remind them of um, of of why it's so important. I think this is a good time to segue into cases.
Go,
Yeah.
go for it.
Should we just start talking about those cases, Wendy, that we were talking about earlier, because they're
Very apropos for right now. Yes.
yeah, because that we're thinking about that situation. So these are both cases that I've consulted on recently out of the state of Florida, which is not a good place to give birth, from what I can tell. I just hear so many stories of women being abused there. I've heard multiple stories of quarter and cesareans happening in the state of Florida over the years. I've heard stories about women escaping quarter and cesareans from Florida, driving across state lines and having their babies, even though the doctors swore up and down that their body would explode if they tried that. And now, and now I just hear a lot about women being mistreated. And I don't know if it's because doctors know that it's not that hard to get a judge to agree, you know what I mean, to write an order, that they feel more entitled. But there's lots of like not even asking, you know what I mean, and just doing stuff to women's bodies, and the women are, I think something to flag, when we're talking about why do you guys have us on here, is to like, so that the pregnant patient can be the decision maker regarding their care about things like cesarean section. And why is that important? It's important to your physical health because for all kinds of reasons, you know what I mean? Your baby's physical health for all kinds of reasons. It's also important to your mental health. And the way that women are treated when they're birthing their babies affects their mental health. And the violation of informed consent in childbirth causes mental health injuries, including PTSD. And so I think just like talking explicitly about the fact that this is not about birth experience, you know what I mean? This is about health, and it's also about mental health. And mental health is the leading cause of maternal death in the United States, which is, already has a maternal death problem. And our latest cause of maternal death with our maternal death problem is like mental health, including suicide. So preventing injury is very important, and that includes protecting choice. So, but that's not happening in the state of Florida. So both of these cases involve the situation about birth after 3 prior cesareans. Both of them involve the situation where that first cesarean is highly questionable necessity, and then the second and third were you had a cesarean, so you're having another. And, maybe there wasn't yet total consciousness of, there was trust. There was trust. Most people understandably go through healthcare assuming things are only being recommended to them if they need them, you know what I mean, or if it's necessary. And so it's often well into the sort of cesarean section journey before people are realizing about, that this might have not been necessary and injuries being caused. So case number one involves this person had 3 prior cesareans and is themselves a doula and a midwife in training, has become educated regarding birth before this fourth birth, and had dialogue with the OBs at the hospital about, I do not want another cesarean. I want a trial of labor. I understand that your hospital will not allow, VBAC after 3, but what about my right to refuse surgery? And the doctor was like, oh, no, well, of course, we can't force you. You know what I mean? So if you come in and you decline surgery, we're not going to force you or anything. And so she went into labor and she presented at the hospital, and they were ready with an iPad with a judge on it to get a court order to force her into the cesarean. And the judge issued the order, and this woman was given a court-ordered forced angry cesarean. Usually by the time they get the judge's order, it's like they're like committing it angrily by the time they do it. And she's injured and traumatized, needless to say. Case number 2, also out of the state of Florida, defending a home birth midwife who supported a home birth after 3 cesareans, right? So look at what's the context in which women, what are the choices that women are facing as the cesareans mount up in each system. And in this case, first cesarean was your baby's too big to fit out your pelvis according to our machines, and then the baby comes out 7 pounds 9 ounces. And the second cesarean was you had a cesarean before. Third cesarean was, well, of course, now it's all cesareans. And then this case, I didn't even realize it until this case really put a pin on this for me. After 3 cesareans, they recommended that she have her tubes tied. You know what I mean? Because it's like something nobody mentions before the first, second, or third cesareans. So only after all these, the only safe thing for you to do is another cesarean, such that we're not even going to talk about a vaginal birth, right? Now, because you've had 3 cesareans, we're going to tell you your family's over. Oh, did we not talk about whether you wanted a large family? And so and of course, needless to say, if you're disobedient enough not to have your tubes tied and get pregnant, then you're going to have another cesarean here. And, I definitely hope that some of the resources that ICAN is distributing include information about how those risks to the mother are mounting after each cesarean. What are we looking at by the time we're at that 4th cesarean? The risks to the mother are extraordinary. And then 5th cesarean, what are we looking at in terms of risks to the mother at that point? And so she searched and searched for that midwife willing to support her. And that's a whole thing about like the midwives who are brave enough to commit to supporting women in their informed decisions are often vulnerable for doing that, legally vulnerable for doing that. And the more that the decision that the woman is making is one that would displease the doctors at the hospital, the more at risk the midwife is for supporting her and making that informed choice, regardless of the risks that they're going to actually impose on this woman through the decisions that they want to make on her behalf, right? Regardless of the actual risk profile. So 3 cesareans, she finds the midwife who will drive 70 minutes to her. And after her three, she has a home birth after 3 cesareans, beautiful birth, everything goes gorgeous. Several years later, she gets pregnant again. They're going to have a fifth baby. This woman said, when I interviewed her, she said, if it wasn't for my beloved midwife, I wouldn't have my fourth or fifth child. You know what I mean? Because I needed that support to try a vaginal birth. And so they planned the birth, healthy pregnancy. And bottom line is labor was precipitous. So she like started having mild contractions around 7:30 a.m. and was like, I'm not ready for you to come yet. And they were still widely spaced. And then 8:30 was like, well, they're picking up. I'm not, 8:50. Now they started to, she said, okay, we're ready for you to head over. But then labor was happening so quickly that the baby came out while the midwife was on the way in the car and needed a transfer to the hospital, needed, some support at the NICU, went to the NICU, was treated and returned home. Baby's fine. But because the hospital became aware that this had been a planned home birth after 3 cesareans, a complaint was filed on the midwife, who is now going to have to defend her ability to practice at all for daring to support this woman and having any choice other than her tubes tied or another cesarean. So, I think those two cases are a great illustration of everything that ICAN exists to address.
Oh. Is home birth after 3 cesareans legal in
What is
Oregon?
legal?
Okay, right. So
In,
is
in
any
Oregon, so there's scope, there's regulatory scope, right? Like sometimes when midwives are licensed, a state writes regulations that detail who is within scope for them. Oregon is such a state. Here in Oregon, midwives can do VBAC after 3 cesareans with an OB consult. I'm not sure exactly what the landscape is, but around other states, and Wendy, maybe you can speak to that also. But like, that's just midwife scope. You know what I mean? That's not a question of, are you allowed to let your baby out your vagina at home? You know what I mean? Like, that's a different question. Wendy, what are your thoughts?
I think that you've hit a really good distinction that, you as an autonomous being can have your baby wherever you want to, generally speaking, in any state. It's more about the person that you decide to have there and what rules surround them. So CNMs have a different scope than LMs or CMs, or there's a ton of different credentials around midwifery, and each credential has its own scope that when you get a license to practice, you agree to abide by that scope. So that kind of is what defines everything, where every single state is so different. Even in the VBAC realm, like for example, here in Arizona, we as licensed midwives can attend VBAC, but only one cesarean. We have to be within 30 miles of a hospital, and it cannot be a breech as well as a cesarean. Why? Who knows? They threw that other rule in there. So we've got rules around our VBAC, but it was only 10 years ago that we were allowed as licensed midwives to legally attend VBACs at home. And so just 10 years ago. Beyond that, it was considered illegal for licensed midwives to attend. Where CNMs have a much wider scope, it's not very defined as far as like the details of you can do 3 cesareans, da da da. It's more, what is the standard of care? What are you doing around that to protect yourself? Do you have the education, the knowledge, the skill in order to do whatever you are about to do? And then what is the literature say? What does the standard of care say? That's what you're going to be held to more than a dictated line by line,
All of which is alarming, isn't it? You know what I mean? For the professional's ability to do this standard of care. So they're going to get other nurse midwives to say, well, we don't allow that. You know what I mean? Because of course, what they're doing is illegal and unethical, but it's what everybody else does. And they're calling it a standard of care. And so, midwives in this, like, and here in Oregon, for example, a home birth, a direct entry midwife can attend a VBAC after 2 or 3 at home, but not in a birth center. Birth centers aren't allowed to support that. And so like what? Like none of that makes sense, right? And all it does is like drives the pregnant people into a situation where they've got nowhere to turn, and they're having to have like the higher the risk goes, the more they're being abandoned by the system, and the more they're in a situation where they're at a higher risk, but their only option for a vaginal birth is unassisted. Like that's an unethical system. And you could call any regulation that says a midwife must abandon her client if her client chooses X, despite risk factor Y, that puts the midwife having to choose between law and ethics. You know what I mean? And some midwives will disobey the law to do what is ethical to their client. But the clients need to understand the vulnerability of the midwife and be prepared to defend and protect her if and when she is attacked for having supported their choice, and understand how brave she's being to do so.
You guys had mentioned breach. Can we talk a little bit about breach? I mean, it's not a common thing anymore for providers to be skilled at breach. And then what we face is that they don't give us a choice. They kind of just say, well, your baby is breech. We'll sign you up for a C-section at 39 weeks, and that's that. Can you guys speak to that situation?
I'll just say I actually have a little bit of hope coming from the provider side that Breach is making a resurgence thanks to like Breach Without Borders, Dr. Stu. There's some great teachers out there that are really hounding this and are getting into hospitals to train hospital OBs this skill and art again. So my hope is that there is the resurgence I feel is true, but it's definitely a pretty sad landscape still currently for sure.
So breach is like VBAC, where like to say this is you only have one option is not evidence-based because there's risks on both sides of the options. You know what I mean? Like just as with VBAC, just as like the choice between repeat, there's risks with a repeat cesarean and there's risks with a VBAC, and you could say that after each cesarean, the risks of each go up, but it's not the case that there's a safe and an easy choice, that it's so imbalanced that it's like that you can't even be allowed to consider that one choice. That's just not evidence-based. And so same with breech, right? Like the truth is that there's risks on both sides of vaginal birth and cesarean for breech, such that the evidence doesn't justify taking that decision away from the patient. It was taken away for reasons that were about provider preference, and convenience and sort of the needs of the institution, and not about, just like everything else in obstetrics, right? Starting with getting on our backs with our feet in the stirrups, not about the needs of birthing females, and physiology of childbirth. Those policies are all illegal, and yet it's like, ubiquitous. And so this gives me another chance to talk about another case. In Oregon, I have another breach case. I have another case going, a plaintiff's lawsuit that will go to trial in February of 2026, where my client was told, your baby, it was first time mom, trusted everybody. And they said, oh, I mean, yeah, long story short. I mean, the longer story is that she actually had a feeling that her baby was not Vertex at like her 35, 36, and 37-week prenatals, and was like, would you mind something? I was just wondering if you would check. And they're like, oh, no need to check. Yeah, meh. And oh, we're very good with our hands. Your baby's Vertex. And then they said, well, okay, we want to induce you, for all, because you're like hypertension or whatever. And she said, well, okay, we'll induce you for a vaginal birth, like, in the next few days. And she said, well, will you check the baby's position now? So they bring over the ultrasound and check, and they say, oh, your baby's breech. I'll call in the doctor, this as the midwife. Oh, your baby's breech, so you're having a C-section, just like you said, Samantha. And she said, well, what are my options for delivering vaginally? And the doctor said, nowhere in Oregon will deliver breech vaginally, which, by the way, breech is within midwife scope for out-of-hospital birth here in Oregon. OHSU. I mean, they're skilled providers, and these people actually admitted in their depositions when I questioned the obstetricians that breech babies have been born right there at that hospital. They know it could happen. You know what I mean? Like it was an option. It was just an option they chose not to mention. And she said, well, okay. And so then the anesthesiologist for the C-section said, okay, we're going to give you spinal block because that's what we do for C-sections. And then he injected the needle too high, hit her in a nerve. Short-term effect was that she suffocated through the cesarean, thought she was dying, came out traumatized. Long-term effect is that was 2019. And to this day, she lives with constant chronic back pain at the site of injection where they hit the nerve, and constant numbness and tingling of both hands and feet, like ants are crawling all over them, which is a really good example of how that you're having a cesarean story like externalizes onto the birthing woman all of the risks or many of the risks of cesarean that you then just live with, as and are just told it's just birth. So, this actually can let me talk a little about the skills, right? So they'll say, well, you can't make us do it. We're not skilled. So, what's so important to understand, first of all, is that the way that that's discussed gives people the impression, because remember, we don't learn birth and sex ed, so most people don't know about birth, right? And the way doctors will say, well, the thing is, we don't have the skills, gives the impression that breech babies can only be born through the hand skills of the doctor, and the truth is, most breech births happen without anybody touching the baby, and the important rule is don't touch that baby. So when we talk about skills, we're actually talking about those minority of breech births where the baby gets stuck, and in those circumstances, special skills are needed. Now, OBs will admit they were all trained in those skills. They just don't use them very often because they push everybody into cesarean, but they will also admit it's the same skills they can use if the head gets entrapped in the pelvis in a cesarean, which it can do. Actually, you know what I mean? The skills are if the head or the arms don't come out easily, right? Then they have to use these things, but that can happen from the top side. I didn't know this. It can happen from the top side. And they use the same things where they bring down the little arms, you pull on the chin, same skill. So, and what I can also show in this case is that the cost of training all those obstetricians at this hospital would have been a couple $1,000s. And then what's the benefit? Follow the money. What's the benefit of like giving everybody, which is 3% of the population, with a breech baby a cesarean because we don't have the skills, you know what I mean? With all of the hospital admissions and fees that come from planned cesareans. It ends up being profitable, routinely profitable for hospitals across the nation.
In other specialties, nobody would purposely not attend to 3 to 4% of their population because they say, well, it's too hard to get trained, or I don't have those skills, or I haven't been using them.
Yeah.
It should be on them to get trained and continue to be supported so that they can offer that option.
And remember, they're not offering you a vaginal birth. Vaginal birth is a physiological process that your body's offering the world. You know what I mean? At the end of your pregnancy,
Right.
All they're doing is saying that they're going to abandon you, that they will not support you in the physical. They won't offer you healthcare services for that. And you're right, like you're saying, they're obstetricians. It's their job to not be skilled. There's no excuse for that. These are basic obstetric skills.
If it were a men's specialty, I just can't imagine a man wanting to go through, like urology. Would you want surgery instead of something that was completely natural? They wouldn't be okay with that. And I don't think it would happen as often. I
Right.
think,
And nor would most men allow themselves to be treated in healthcare the way that women do in pregnancy and childbirth.
yeah.
Not
And
to
that
blame the
goes
victim.
that goes back to culture, right? This
Right.
is how we are, I don't know, for lack of a better word, groomed um as children, as teens, not being taught to speak up for ourselves. We have different expectations in the classroom than boys. Um, it's all very interesting.
So this
But
kind of
go
grooming,
ahead.
I think we should talk about grooming in the context of language. I was thinking about this in terms of your question about what are the words to use in the birth room so that you're not abused. And part of that relates to resisting language like we're offering you a vaginal birth, you know what I mean? Or even the language of trial of labor is highly problematic, you know what I mean? Like think about the word trial of labor or candidate for a vaginal birth. Both, what is trial? You know what I mean? Like, what is candidate? Like a
You're
trial,
you're
like,
already assuming that it's not going to happen by
well, like,
using the
I
word
think what
trial.
those words imply is that somebody else is the decision maker. When something's, you're going to have a trial, there's going to be a trial, but somebody else decides in a trial. You know what I mean? Like you're on trial, you can have a trial, but there's an implication that you're not the decision maker. And candidate is for like you're running for office or you're applying for a job. And when you're running for office or applying for a job, somebody else is going to decide. You know what I mean? And so those words are both totally inappropriate for a physiological process. You know what I mean? And a wild reframing of how cesareans, what cesarean section in the past or whatever before, presumably it's like there's a physiological process of birth, and then if needed, you can offer a cesarean to assist because something's gone wrong or for whatever reason. But now it's like cesarean section's what's going to happen unless we allow you we offer the service of a trial if you're a candidate. All of that. Don't buy into it. You know what I mean? Reclaim the words. You don't have to necessarily confront them with the problems with their words because they're like everybody else's candidate. But instead, you can just come back to what you use the words that you're talking about, which is I want to be able to go through the physiological process of vaginal birth. You can say, I want a trial. Sometimes you have to talk their language. But I want to be able to go into labor. I don't want to have a cesarean unless and until there's an indication that I actually need one. And if so, and for me, that would be signs and, I mean, it just sucks so much though. And we're getting back to the vulnerability of where you're laboring because you say, unless there's a sign of that I need one, they're like, oh, the monitor blipped. You're not dilating fast enough. You know what I mean? Like, what are the reasons? And it comes back to how important it is to be giving birth with people you can trust, if at all possible. That's the best thing you can do is, I mean, of course, if that was so easy, we wouldn't be here. Do you want
One of
to
those,
take some questions from the group since they're like sitting passively
sure.
listening?
Um, does anybody have any questions? I don't have any open questions in the
Okay.
question and answer. You guys can go ahead and put those in there anytime you want, and we'll get to that. Is
Okay.
there anything positive, any hope that you can give us around rights and in pregnancy and birth?
Wendy?
This is
Yes.
going.
The activation or emerging organization of people of color and organizations of color of like the realization that like sexism is the baseline for the abuse of women in childbirth, and then for every additional layer of otherness that is projected onto the birthing person by their providers, they're more likely to die, they're more likely to see their baby die, they're more likely to come out traumatized. And in the United States, that is borne the most heavily by the descendants of historically enslaved Americans. And around the world, it's like migrant workers, Roma people, but it can be tribal, but it gets to the importance of culturally competent care, people giving birth with, recognizing we have more recognition, I think. Maybe Wendy, there's that, just more recognition of trauma as mattering, more recognition of mental health as an issue, like we're moving somewhat out of the like safety versus birth experience false dichotomy, so and then there's more recognition of disparity of and then that's causing like a more centralizing of the voices of the people who have been the most abused within the system. And so I think the best we can do is to centralize and elevate the voices of the people that are the most. So in America, for example, Black women do have the highest cesarean rate, and it has been proven that it's not because of their clinical condition that they're presenting with, that it's one more manifestation of racism. And then, of course, then the downstream conversations about, I mean, many of the people whose cases I'm describing to you or could tell you are Black women. They're being abused in childbirth, and then Black doulas are both essential, but then also themselves vulnerable to racism, mistreatment, that much more, you know what I mean, to more abuse, vulnerable to more abuse in trying to protect their clients. But in general, it's like if an advocacy organization like ICAN can focus on and elevate the voices of the folks that are being the most mistreated, that like the rising tide raises all the ships. You know what I mean? It will, everybody will it will bring everybody along, as opposed, you know what I mean? So I think that we're in a better place to do that now than maybe 50 years ago, you know what I mean? In second wave feminism, where there was like white feminists leading the way, or like having the privilege and opportunity to like enter public discourse about women's rights, but then unconsciously centralizing, or I don't know if I'm excuse making here, centralizing their own concerns and not making sure everybody's concerns were met so that, you know, it was ultimately not effective. So I think that for me, that's positive, the discourse and the organization and the recognition.
I would just echo that in really public places, like we've heard it from the White House, we've heard it in Congress now. And so the lawmakers are discussing a lot of these, and they might be the peripheral elements, but at least things are starting discussion in public discord. And I love that. I'm really excited about how much that is true. And we see it pretty much in every state as well as in national Congress.
Mhm.
We have a few questions now. So what can we do to advocate for midwifery licensure changes? Here in New Jersey, midwives can't attend VBACs at home or in a birth center.
Mhm. I have found, I mean, we just did this 10 years ago here, and by far it is a consumer-led movement. If the consumers aren't on fire about this and desire it, midwives can't fight for it. We're, a handful of people versus thousands of people. And really somehow harnessing that the power of many and creating a consumer group that really wants to push for the legalization of VBACs with a provider. I'm not sure if is midwifery legal in New Jersey? I'm not sure to what degree or what type, but really changing those rules. But starting from a consumer base is the only way to move forward.
And the next question is, what options besides unassisted birth exist for laboring in a trusted environment when there are no providers in a state that will support you?
This question is so sad. It could make me cry, right, Wendy? Like, and this is the reality of childbirth after cesarean and with many other kinds of risk factors in the United States. And it like, I mean, the question is like self-contained, you know what I'm saying? Like, uh, there's this could open a whole nother hour-long podcast, which you guys should have on unassisted birth, because you could call a birth keeper, but we need a lot of clarity around this. First of all, that I would say that if I never hear that word again, it'll be too soon, because the word birth keeper is blurring the line between doula and midwife. A lot of times when midwives can't show up because they feel afraid under their licensure that they're going to lose their license if they show up for a client, doulas are willing to do so. And the doula can't monitor for a rupture, you know what I mean? Can't do anything, but there's somebody there, so, like, who maybe has some more experience with birth. But in those circumstances, it's so important to have that. I think there's a lot of confusion happening currently in unassisted birth about whether doulas are midwives, because doulas are calling themselves birth keepers or even traditional midwives when they're not traditional midwives. They're doulas. And so they don't have the skills to actually do anything clinical or assess anything clinical. But they can create a trusted environment. And those options suck, dudes. And that's why we're doing what we do. You shouldn't have to have those options.
How do you recommend advocating for a client as a doula when there's fear the provider can exclude you from the room if they perceive you to be interfering?
So if there's fear, you know what I mean? So step one is to face the fear. And I would recommend facing that fear prenatally first with yourself. This whole idea of do doulas have a scope comes, I believe, from like the fact that women are acculturated to be very uncomfortable with conflict, even before we get to the specifics of doula's concerns of like, they don't want us in here anyway. Already it's like, we're uncomfortable with it. So we made up this whole scope concept to pretend that we're not allowed. You are allowed, and you get to decide if you want to do it. So first sit with yourself. Am I willing to get over my own fear, you know what I mean, and discomfort to do the job of advocating for clients? Because at the end of the day, it's like, are you going to be a doula? You know what I mean? Like, or are you going to be a doctor pleaser? Because if you can't be a doula, or you define doula and your job description to take off the advocacy piece, and it's just educator and supporter, but not advocate. But if it includes advocate, then you have to face the possibility that they might not like it when you advocate and when you remind them that your client has rights. And so then if you're willing to do that yourself, then do that work with your client. I've got more podcasts on this, and we could talk about it more outside of this webinar, Sarah. You know, it's that you and your client can actually do role play, you know what I mean, around what comes up, but really that the client introducing you at the start of the shift to everybody in the room. This is my doula, Sarah. Part of what I've asked her to do for me today is to look out for my right of informed consent and refusal. So I've just asked her to speak up anytime that she sees that things get so busy around here. I understand, you know what I mean? And so if anything just starts to move so quickly and that hasn't happened, she knows how important it is to me, and that's her role for me today. And so then if you do speak up, hopefully it's less shocking to them. You know what I mean? It's less like, why is it talking? And now you have a role on that team, and your role includes reminding them about the right that's written on the wall. You know, the patient rights are written right there.
As far as providers go, what are their rights within the system when they honor a woman's right to informed consent? Seeing providers who do this, they sometimes can take a big hit because of supporting the right to choose, and we at times lose these providers.
Wendy?
Yeah, I've seen this so many times in 25 years. Providers that are very open, very willing to see all kinds of pregnant people with all kinds of stories and histories, and has opened them up to vulnerability. And guess what? Everyone flocks to them because finally someone's listening. Finally, someone is, holding this space where they can have the birth that they want, and generally, usually, very successfully. And so then, the notoriety gets around, and more people come, and then two things happen. One, their insurance, their malpractice provider gets wind of all of the things that they're doing, allowing, and they get a little crazy, imposing different restrictions, imposing more fees, things like that. So malpractice insurance can get involved a little bit, because they're doing more quote unquote risky things, so they can jack up things. So they get hit in that way, and then they can decide what they want to do in that realm. And then the other way is just burnout, strict burnout. And I've seen this countless times here in Phoenix of a provider that really does work with the community and really wants true informed consent and will really respect that space. Again, everyone in the world comes to them because of what they're holding, and they just get burnt out. They just can't. We have a doctor right now who is so incredible, but he's literally on call 24/7. He rarely takes time off because he is the only one. He's the only one that does breech at this one hospital. Like, whatever it is, he is the one. And so everyone comes to him. And if he's not on call, then that person does not get the things that were promised. And so literally he's on call 24. How long can a provider last like that? They can't. And there will be burnout. And that's crushing because there are so few of them. And because there's so few of them that give that respect towards informed consent, burnout and then malpractice, those are the two reasons I've seen just devastate.
We need those providers teaching the med students so that we kind of, help them to develop these kind of feelings toward their patients and respect for people, as they're training, so that they don't become just part of the system.
Right. And then that's another level of responsibility, right, on their shoulders of already.
Yeah, that's true.
Thank God this one doctor that is here that is just so open. Um, he's completely taken on a huge load at the university and taking on students. But again, it's just another layer of stress, another layer that he's putting on already a huge workload of responsibility. Mm-hmm.
Someone asked,
Well, let me just supplement that as well. Like for the providers, it's like, that what are their rights? They do have the right to respect their clients' rights. You know what I mean? So like that there's that, right? So it's like if you're the provider, like they're like, why are you doing the service of breach? Why are you doing the service of VBAC? Sorry, I'm not doing the service of anything. You know what I mean? What I am doing is the service of doing my job, of catching this baby as she goes through the physiological process of birth after declining my offer and maybe even my recommendation that I was forced to make by you people of cesarean section or transfer or whatever it is. And I've documented that here. So what can providers document, document, document? The riskier their choice that you're supporting, the more robust your documentation of their informed decision should be. Um, uh, but I think providers can defend themselves by saying, wait a second, do you pulling out ACOG June 2016 statement on maternal refusal of medically recommended treatment, which is an excellent statement that makes very clear that that provider is in the right. It's never ever right to force treatment on anybody. And so I don't understand. Do you all disagree with this? Do you disagree with this? Because I'm just following this and I thought this was basic bioethics. That you have the right to do that and you can use that to defend yourself.
And
But on that point, ICAN as a consumer network needs to remember if you want those providers, we lose those providers, protect those providers. You know what I mean? Like one of these themes through these questions is like, for example, and this relates to, changing the home birth laws, right? Like, and what Wendy was talking about earlier, like it's hard for the providers to stand up for the rights of women. You know what I mean? Women need to stand up for their own rights and provide with the support of the providers, with the support of attorneys. But just being vocal supporters and just asking them, how can I support you? Do you need support? Um, you know, can help.
So who should people contact to change laws? How do they get started?
They should organize at the local level. Form an ICAN chapter, hold meetings, start talking about your local problems. The answers will evolve from that.
Mhm, mhm.
What about training doulas as legal observers? Do you have those in the United States?
Doulas are awesome witnesses. This is one of these things where, look, a legal observer in another like cultural context or international context, they would be working for some organization. So there could be an ICANN could, well, unless they're reporting back to you, there has to be some base, you know what I mean, to which they're reporting back. But that frame, we can use that just as doulas. It's within their job description. You know what I mean? As supporter, advocate, and educator, you end up being a witness. And it's a very powerful role that doulas can have if you document what you're experiencing correctly, if you write down the names of the providers you're meeting at every single birth, your experiences with them, what you observe about do they respect informed consent? And then even better, if groups of doulas start putting that data together, this is something I talk about a lot of doula organizations. Like doulas could become a very powerful force for change through the documentation of their observations and what they witness in terms of rights violations.
Would doulas have to be worried about being hunted down for doing something like that, especially if it's made public?
Hunted down.
Um, like like the providers who you're talking about may not be happy about what you're writing. And
Talking about,
so,
I'm not recommending anybody goes on blogging. You know what I mean? What I'm
oh
talking
no,
about is organized, you know what I mean, witnessing and observation. This is a whole, again, like I could do a whole nother hour-long webinar on doulas as observers and witnesses. You know what I mean? And then we could talk about what are some of the ways that doulas could organize, document, because rather than publish a blog about how Dr. X is such a jerk, you could take your data and go to the legislature, you know what I mean? And get the laws you want. That's what we're talking about. Right,
oh,
Wendy?
Yeah, and even the boards,
Right.
if doulas are constantly seeing Dr. X do whatever and they're documenting it, I mean,
Or Hospital X.
powerful to go to the hospital, to go to their board, to go, there's so many avenues you can take that information. And again, in numbers, even more powerful than just one person's story. And that's, yeah, absolutely. You've got the power there.
And I mean, also because the doula like bridges so many spaces that no other provider bridges. So if it's a planned community birth, you could bridge that space from community to the hospital. You also might see that person post, you just have another, you can do narrative storytelling about the impacts on the patients of these hospital policies. Um, yeah, there's all kinds of ways in which that data could be used if it were gathered and organized.
so who in like specifically would they contact in the legislature or at the medical
That
board?
is a state by state issue.
Okay.
Yeah, that's beyond the scope of what we can do in a webinar today. And
All
on that note, nothing that either of us has said today is legal advice for any individual. You should contact a lawyer in your state for your particular legal inquiry.